What if I told you the US just lost $847 billion without a single missile being fired? That while you were sleeping, America's closest ally quietly launched an economic rebellion that could collapse entire industries, and no one in Washington saw it coming. On a quiet Sunday morning in 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before cameras and said four words that shattered a 70-year alliance: no more, no more. In that moment, Canada didn't just announce a housing plan, it declared war. Not with weapons, but with timber, steel, and aluminum. For decades, America turned Canadian resources into profit, then sold them back at triple the price. But now Canada has flipped the script, and the fallout could cripple U.S. factories, construction, and supply chains. This isn't just about housing. It's about the beginning of the end of American dominance. And the most shocking part, this may only be the beginning. Number one, the bombshell announcement. It happened without warning. No press leaks, no insider rumors, just a quiet, calculated detonation of one of the most important economic relationships in modern history. On a cold Sunday morning in early 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to a podium flanked by officials from his housing ministry. At first glance, it seemed like a standard policy announcement, another government trying to solve a housing crisis. But what came next sent shockwaves through boardrooms and political offices across the United States. With the cameras rolling, Carney spoke four simple words: no more, no more. No more exporting Canadian timber, steel, and aluminum just to buy it back at a premium. No more playing the junior partner in a lopsided economic game that benefited American factories while draining Canadian families. No more allowing Wall Street investors to dictate the terms of Canada's housing market. In one short speech, Carney ended a trade dynamic that had defined the North American economy for over 7 decades. What looked like a housing initiative was actually something far more dangerous, an economic breakup dressed as domestic reform. The announcement of the Build Canada Homes program wasn't just about building affordable housing, it was a declaration of economic sovereignty. Carney revealed that Canada would no longer be exporting its raw materials to the U.S. for processing. Instead, Canada would invest billions into building a powerful domestic manufacturing base, one that would take its own timber, aluminum, and steel and use it to create modular, factory-built housing at scale. Homes built faster, cheaper, and entirely on Canadian soil. But what truly stunned analysts wasn't just the plan, it was the timing. Carney made the announcement just weeks after Donald Trump returned to the White House, vowing to ramp up tariffs and punish nations that didn't play by America's trade rules. Everyone expected Canada to fold under pressure. Instead, they flipped the table. While Trump was flexing on TV, Carney was silently building an escape hatch, an economic backup plan that would completely sidestep the U.S. market. The message was clear: Canada is done asking for permission. And this wasn't just political theater. Billions in contracts, supply chains, and industries were about to be restructured overnight. America didn't just lose a partner, it lost control. And the consequences were already spreading like wildfire. Number two, the dirty secret. For decades, Canadians were told they had a strong economic partnership with the United States. Politicians praised cross-border trade, calling it a win-win. But behind the smiles and handshakes was a brutal, one-sided reality that almost no one dared to admit. The truth? Canada wasn't America's partner, it was its supplier. And the price of that role was nothing short of national economic sabotage. Here's how the system worked. Canada shipped its raw materials, timber, steel, aluminum, and more, straight to U.S. factories. American industries processed those resources, slapped on a Made in the USA label, and then sold the finished products back to Canada at 3 times the cost. It was a loop that drained Canadian wealth while fueling American profits. And the most outrageous part? This cycle became so normalized that no one questioned it. Not the media, not the politicians, not even the public. In 2024 alone, Canada spent a jaw-dropping $847 billion buying back products made from its own raw materials. Think about that. Canadian lumber, transformed into building panels in Michigan. Canadian aluminum, molded into windows in Ohio. Canadian steel, reshaped into siding in Texas. Then all of it sold right back to the families who supplied the resources in the first place. It was economic absurdity, packaged as cooperation. And while American billionaires got rich, millions of Canadian families paid the price. Nearly half of Canadian households, around 19 million people, earn less than $90,000 a year. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, that's not even enough to dream of owning a home. Families are being squeezed out of their own country, priced out by a system that benefits everyone but them. While Canadians struggled to pay rent, U.S. processing plants were raking in record profits. It wasn't a trade agreement, it was a trap, a slow bleed that left Canada dependent and vulnerable, and yet no one stopped it until now. Mark Carney's announcement exposed the rot. By refusing to send raw materials south, he wasn't just starting a housing program, he was cutting the cord. That cord that fed American industry and drained Canadian prosperity. The dirty secret was finally out in the open. Canada wasn't being helped, it was being harvested. And now that the truth is exposed, there's no going back. Because once a country realizes it's being used, the next step is simple. Take everything back. And that's exactly what's happening. Number 3, the empire crumbles. The moment Canada said no more, the foundation of a 70-year economic empire began to crack. For generations, the U.S. quietly relied on Canadian raw materials to fuel its industrial machine. It was a relationship built on convenience. Canada provided the resources, America took the profits. But when Carney flipped the script, what once looked like a stable alliance was suddenly exposed as dangerously fragile. The U.S. manufacturing sector, especially in key states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, had become completely dependent on Canadian inputs. These weren't optional supplies, they were the lifeblood of American industry. Steel for skyscrapers, aluminum for vehicles, lumber for housing developments, all flowing north to south day after day. But with a single announcement, that pipeline dried up, and Washington had no backup plan. What made Carney's move so devastating was how quietly it had been prepared. While Trump was threatening tariffs and boasting about trade wars, Canada was building its own internal ecosystem, modular housing factories, domestic processing plants, and infrastructure designed to cut American middlemen out completely. It wasn't just a policy shift, it was economic warfare in disguise, and it worked. Within weeks, American processing plants started reporting shortages. Construction companies scrambled to source materials at higher costs. Industries that had taken Canadian supply for granted suddenly found themselves exposed, weak, and bleeding money. Washington couldn't believe it. For decades, Canada had played the role of the polite, cooperative junior partner. No one expected them to become the aggressor. But that's exactly what happened. Modular housing became the weapon. Not only were these homes built faster and cheaper, but they were manufactured entirely on Canadian soil. That meant jobs, profits, and innovation, all staying in the country. And the kicker? They could be built year-round, even through brutal Canadian winters. Meanwhile, American builders, still stuck in outdated methods, faced weather delays and soaring labor costs. This shift wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. Canada was no longer asking to be included. It was rewriting the rules. And in doing so, it shattered the illusion of American economic invincibility. The empire, once untouchable, was now scrambling to respond. The U.S. had always assumed Canada would play by the rules, their rules. But Carney just threw out the old playbook. And as the shock waves spread through global markets, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The age of American dominance was no longer guaranteed. Number 4, Carney's war plan. While most world leaders respond to economic pressure with cautious diplomacy, Mark Carney launched a calculated and ruthless campaign, and he did it all under the banner of housing reform. To the public, Build Canada Homes looked like a domestic plan to tackle affordability. But behind the scenes, it was a precision-engineered blueprint for economic independence designed to dismantle the U.S.-Canada dependency one strategic move at a time. Kearny's war plan had three clear missions. Mission 1, industrial warfare. Canada would no longer ship raw materials to the U.S. for processing. Instead, new factories across the country would handle everything domestically, turning Canadian timber, aluminum, and steel into finished products right at home. This wasn't just about saving money or creating jobs. It was about cutting American factories out of the loop entirely. And with modular housing technology advancing fast, Canada suddenly had a tool the U.S. couldn't compete with: homes that are built 50% faster, 20% cheaper, and aren't slowed down by winter weather. Mission 2, the $13 billion war chest. This was the heart of the plan. Kearny didn't throw money at the housing crisis, he weaponized it. The $13 billion investment wasn't just for building homes, it was a strategic lure for private investors. By backing domestic manufacturing with government funding, Canada instantly became a magnet for capital, startups, and innovation. In effect, Kearny took the same economic engine that once powered U.S. cities and redirected it north, fueling Canadian factories, supply chains, and jobs while starving out American counterparts. Mission 3, the rental fortress. To ensure Canadian families weren't left behind, Kearny launched a $1.5 billion fund to acquire vulnerable rental properties. But this wasn't just a social safety net, it was a firewall. By locking thousands of units into permanent affordability and shutting out foreign investors, especially from the U.S., Kearny made it nearly impossible for Wall Street to keep treating Canada's housing market as a playground. The strategy was clear: protect Canadians, block outsiders, and use housing as both a shield and a sword. Each piece of Kearny's plan was aggressive, targeted, and deliberately timed. While Trump was busy reviving old-school trade wars, Kearny was playing 4D economic chess. This wasn't just bold leadership, it was a silent revolution. And for the first time in decades, Canada was no longer reacting to American policy. It was setting the pace, and the world was starting to notice. Number 5, American fallout. The fallout came fast, and it hit harder than anyone in Washington expected. Within weeks of Kearny's announcement, the cracks in America's industrial foundation began to show. Processing plants in key battleground states, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, sounded the alarm. These weren't small businesses, they were multi-billion-dollar operations that had for decades relied on a steady, uninterrupted flow of cheap Canadian raw materials. Suddenly, that pipeline was gone. Contracts that were once automatic were now being renegotiated or outright canceled. And for the first time in a generation, it was Canada setting the terms. Steel shortages forced production slowdowns. Aluminum processors began laying off workers. Lumber yards scrambled to secure overpriced alternatives from overseas. American manufacturers, used to predictability and low costs, were blindsided by a partner they had always assumed would stay quiet and cooperative. They'd built their empires on Canadian inputs, but now they were watching those empires crack. The U.S. construction industry, in particular, took a brutal hit. Builders who had long depended on affordable Canadian materials were now facing higher prices and longer delays. Meanwhile, Canada's modular housing factories were hitting full stride, producing homes faster, cheaper, and year-round. And because these homes were factory-built, they required fewer laborers, less time, and far less waste. Suddenly, American construction firms couldn't compete. Then came the economic panic. Investors began pulling out of U.S.-based manufacturing projects tied to cross-border supply chains. Wall Street, once so confident in its grip on Canadian markets, now found itself locked out. The rental fortress strategy blocked U.S. hedge funds from acquiring Canadian properties. Billions in expected returns vanished overnight. The ripple effects touched everything, from trade deals to stock prices, from local jobs to national policy. Behind closed doors, the White House scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were held. Advisors whispered about tariffs, sanctions, even diplomatic pressure. But there was a problem. Build Canada Homes wasn't filed as a trade policy. It was domestic reform. On paper, Canada was simply trying to solve its housing crisis. In reality, it had launched an economic counterstrike the U.S. couldn't touch without looking like a bully. What shocked Washington the most wasn't just the economic impact. It was the power shift. For decades, America called the shots. But now, it was on the defensive. And if Canada could turn its housing crisis into a weapon this effective, what could other nations do next? Number 6. The global copycats. The world was watching, and it didn't take long for other nations to start taking notes. Canada's bold move wasn't just a national strategy, it was a blueprint, a roadmap for how resource-rich countries could finally break free from American-controlled supply chains and build their own industrial independence. And as the shockwaves from Carney's plans spread across global markets, something became clear. Canada might have just lit the fuse on a worldwide economic rebellion. First in line, Mexico. With its massive labor force, abundant natural resources, and growing political frustration with U.S. trade dominance, Mexico began quietly studying Canada's approach. Officials explored modular housing, domestic processing facilities, and government-backed investment funds, almost step by step. With the right policies, Mexico could stop sending raw minerals and cheap labor north and instead build its own manufacturing empire. Then came Australia. With some of the largest reserves of lithium, iron, and critical minerals on Earth, Australia realized it too had been playing the same game, exporting raw materials to be processed in American or Chinese factories. But after seeing Canada take control of its own value chains, Australian leaders began rethinking everything. Reports surfaced of new factory build-outs, local energy strategies, and talks about modular construction systems in remote areas, mirroring what Canada did in the Arctic. Even Europe took notice. Countries like Germany and France had long relied on American corporations to process, distribute, and profit from their raw inputs. But with energy independence becoming a priority and trust in U.S. leadership eroding, EU leaders started asking the same question. Why are we enriching American factories when we have everything we need to build our own? Carney's real genius wasn't just what he did for Canada. It was what he revealed to the world, that American dominance was never inevitable. It was a system built on convenience, dependency, and inertia. Once a country had the political will to break that cycle, everything changed. And now, one by one, other nations are waking up to the same realization. If Canada can do it, so can they. The U.S. spent decades building an empire based on controlling supply chains, trade terms, and economic outcomes. But in a matter of months, one small, polite neighbor proved that empire could be bypassed. And now the copycats are moving, quietly, strategically, and faster than Washington can respond. Number 7. Washington's dilemma. Behind the closed doors of Washington, panic was setting in. The United States, long used to being the puppet master of North American trade, was suddenly backed into a corner. Canada's move had caught them completely off guard. And the worst part? They couldn't fight back the way they usually do. That's the dilemma Washington now faces: retaliate and risk looking like a bully, or stay silent and watch their industrial empire slowly unravel. At first, Trump's advisors floated the usual ideas: tariffs, trade penalties, diplomatic pressure. But there was one massive problem. Canada hadn't broken any rules. Build Canada Homes was legally airtight. On paper, it was a domestic housing initiative. It didn't target the U.S. directly. It wasn't filed as a trade weapon. There were no violations of NAFTA, USMCA, or WTO agreements. Any retaliation would look like an attack on Canada's right to solve its own housing crisis. That's what made Carney's strategy so brilliant. He turned industrial warfare into domestic policy, a $13 billion economic counterattack hidden behind the language of affordability and family support. If the U.S. responded too aggressively, it could trigger global backlash, especially from allies who were already questioning America's grip on global trade. And if they didn't respond at all, their silence would signal weakness. Washington's hands were tied. Behind the scenes, emergency meetings ramped up. Congressional leaders demanded answers. Lobbyists for the steel, aluminum, and lumber industries flooded Capitol Hill with warnings about job losses and factory closures. Governors in key swing states panicked as local industries began reporting disruptions. But there was no clear enemy to blame, because Carney had weaponized the one thing every country is allowed to do: take care of its own people. Even intelligence briefings turned bleak. Analysts warned that Mexico was exploring similar strategies. Australia and Europe were reconsidering their supply chain partnerships. The fear wasn't just about Canada, it was about a domino effect. If more countries followed this playbook, American manufacturers would lose their edge. Wall Street's influence would shrink, and Washington's ability to dictate global economic terms would evaporate. For the first time in decades, the U.S. couldn't simply rewrite the rules to suit its interests. It had met a challenge it couldn't punish or ignore. Carney had changed the game, and Washington had no idea how to play the new one. Number 8. The bigger picture. At first glance, Build Canada Homes looked like a bold housing initiative. Ambitious, yes, but still confined to Canada's internal affairs. But as the dust settles and the ripple effects continue to spread, it's clear this was never just about homes. It was about something far more powerful: economic sovereignty. Mark Carney didn't just address a housing shortage, he redefined Canada's role in the global economy and quietly exposed the vulnerabilities of a system the U.S. thought it controlled. This was a silent revolution disguised as policy. By turning modular housing into a national manufacturing strategy, Carney tackled 3 crises at once: housing affordability, industrial dependency, and national identity. In doing so, he made one thing painfully clear: Canada was done playing backup. It was stepping into the spotlight, not with military might, but with factories, supply chains, and strategy. And now, the whole world is watching. But the bigger picture isn't just about Canada's rise, it's about America's potential fall. The U.S. built an empire on the assumption that its allies would always fall in line, that raw materials would keep flowing in, processed goods would keep flowing out, and American influence would never be questioned. But Carney shattered that illusion. He proved that even a country seen as polite and predictable could turn the tables and walk away, quietly, efficiently, and legally. And here's the uncomfortable truth: if Canada can do it, others will too. Mexico is already studying the model. Europe is reevaluating its dependence on U.S. industry. Even nations in Africa and Asia are looking at modular manufacturing and domestic processing as ways to break free from global supply chains controlled by foreign powers. The floodgates have opened. This isn't just about economics, it's about power. The power to control your own resources, to build for your own people, to stop enriching others at your own expense. And in a world where supply chains decide who wins and who loses, Canada just proved that you don't need to be a superpower to change the game. You just need a plan. Carney didn't fire a single shot. He didn't tear up any treaties. He simply built a system that worked better for his people. And in doing so, he may have launched the biggest shift in North American economics in a generation. The old rules are gone, and a new era has begun. Canada didn't just build homes, it built a new future. What started as a housing solution turned into an economic revolution that exposed America's hidden weaknesses and inspired a global shift. The world is waking up, and the old power dynamics are crumbling. If Carney's blueprint works, it won't stop with Canada. The next wave of nations is already preparing. The question now isn't if the U.S. will fall behind, it's how fast. If you want to see how Mexico is already preparing its own economic rebellion, hit that like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Part 2 is coming, and it's explosive.